produce. So a successful parent is just one that has offspring that survives. And so if those chromosomes can be sort of slightly rearranged, but based on a successful pattern, then you might have a good combination going into the next generation. You might be the one that survives. Mutations are copying errors, and this can happen in your body cells. Those can be induced by things like radiation. Those are usually harmful, but they can also be some sort of a swapping around of genetic material, of your DNA strand. Some are what are called base substitution mutations, which are the A gets swapped with the T, so the T's over here, and then suddenly you've got the A's and the T. This can result in exactly the same instructions. It can be the exact same result. So this can be something that's called synonymous. So it actually has no difference. You can be mutated and you'd never know the difference. You can also have it where the base substitution mutation is non-synonymous, meaning that it actually produces another set of instructions that can be actually quite important and possibly quite disruptive. It could lead to health consequences. You can even have whole duplication of chromosomes. There's a monosomy, which is you have one too few chromosomes. This is a chromosomal condition that some people have. Also trisomy, which is a particular aspect. One form of trisomy is where you have 47 instead of 46 chromosomes. And Klinefelter syndrome is the sex cell is duplicated, or the sex chromosomes are duplicated, so you actually have an X, and a Y chromosome, which means that these people are often born as intersexual individuals, that they have both male and female organs. There's a lot of variety that can take place just from basic sexual reproduction, and this is the sort of thing that allows for the variety that natural selection can work on. Now, in addition to mutation, there's also a couple of factors that genetic evolution has that direct evolution. One of them is what's called gene flow, and the other one is called genetic drift. Now, first let's talk about what we mean by populations of reproducing organisms. That a gene pool is what we refer to as all of the alleles, genes, chromosomes, genotypes within a population that is able to breed with one another. Now, I can't breed with a jellyfish. I can't produce offspring with a jellyfish, so that's not part of my gene pool. But all humans can reproduce with me, which means that is part of our gene pool. We're all part of a gene pool. And genetic evolution is the change in frequency of alleles in a breeding population from generation to generation. And so that can direct things towards certain trends. This can be directional, so adaptive genes can be selected for certain characteristics and move things in one direction. And maladaptive genes are selected against in this breeding population. Now let's say you have two populations of creatures, basically one gene pool, and then suddenly something happens and they get separated. Now, if the separation is temporary, they could come back together and breed again. But if they're separated for long enough, they might diverge in that time, let's say 200,000, 500,000 years. If they diverge directionally away from one another, get different characteristics, they might not be able to come back together. So let's look at something like a horse and a donkey, right? Horses and donkeys are different species of animals, but they must have split recently enough that they can actually come back together and produce offspring with one another. There's an important caveat though, and this is what we call a mule, right? A mule is the offspring of a horse and a donkey. So they're close enough, they diverged, became different species, but they can come back together, mate with one another, and produce offspring. But that offspring is sterile. A mule can't produce offspring. They are always sterile. So they've diverged far enough that they can come back together, produce offspring, but that offspring is non-viable for future generations. So they're going to continue to diverge until a point where they won't actually even be able to reproduce together. That would work for us too. With humans, if I were to get a group of people and get in a spaceship and fly to Mars, and we stayed there for 1 million years and no one came to visit us and we never left the planet, we would have adapted to new conditions, new environmental conditions, new gravity, new diet, new all sorts of things. And if we then rejoined with planet Earth, we would probably be different species and we would probably no longer be able to reproduce with one another. So speciation can occur within humans, but the important factor that keeps species together is this constant interbreeding. This is what we call gene flow. And gene flow is basically admixture. The more you interbreed, the less you're diverging and you're splitting and you're becoming different species. So if you keep coming back together and interbreeding with one another, you're going to stay together as the same gene pool. And that is a factor, a statistical factor, that counteracts speciation, counteracts divergence of species. So gene flow is the exchange of genetic material between populations of the same species or of closely related species that can interbreed, so the same gene pool. It can also produce variety, because you can have different populations with different characteristics that come in, admix, and then blend into the population as well. And so that can actually, it can be additive and give more for that larger population to survive with by increasing the variation. Now, the sort of opposite of this effect is what we call genetic drift, which is a random statistical idea, but what it is it has very real consequences. So let's take a population of fish in a pond, right? Let's say there's 10 fish, 9 of them are gold colored, and 1 of them is red colored, okay? And you stick a cat beside the pond, and it's swiping fish out of the pond. It's random, they're just getting the one that swims close enough, and a cat will grab one of the goldfish and it will eat it, right? So it's predated that, and it wasn't able to reproduce. But because there's 8 other goldfish, you will still see that allele, that color, in the next generation. But let's say that randomly it was the red fish, this one red fish, that swam over and the cat got it. It was the only red fish in that pond, which means that that allele is now missing from that population. Just through random chance of being the unlucky fish that got eaten by the cat, you will never see that red allele again. And now you have that allele, that characteristic, drifted away. So gene flow is the coming together. It flows together, and genetic drift is something drifts away from the population and disappears. Genetic drift can have important repercussions for things like what we call the founder effect. So let's say, go back to this Mars example, right? So we get 30 people together into a rocket ship and go to Mars. We don't represent all of humanity. We only represent the subset of humanity that our group of 30 characteristic, 30 individuals with our characteristics are a subset of the entirety of humanity. So there's going to be characteristics that we don't take with us to Mars. And you will never see those because they never existed in our population of 30. So genetic drift, it produces what's called the founder effect. So those limited characteristics that us 30 had are going to be the only thing that we start with, which means they're going to be emphasized. They're going to be a much bigger effect on Mars than they would be here on Earth. So they've drifted away, but they've actually become much bigger in that isolated population. You can see this in actual, we don't have to go to Mars to see this. There's certain characteristics that, for instance, when we come to this, we're going to see human migration out of Africa and across the Bering Land Bridge into North and South America about 15,000 years or so ago. The people that came across the land bridge got cut off and never went back to Asia. And they became Native Americans, the population that expanded and continued to live on North and South American continents. But they were a subset of the rest of the population in Asia. So they didn't bring over the entirety of that genetic material, only the group that came across. And so you have certain characteristics like type O blood is extremely prevalent in Native American populations. Sorry, not North American, Native American populations, but very rare outside of the Native American populations. So this is the founder effect as well. Now these are statistical things, but they have a real impact on populations. And natural selection is selecting based on those real factors as well. So it's those four mechanisms that you need to remember. Natural selection from Darwin and genetic evolution from Mendel, which includes the mechanism is mutation, gene flow, and genetic drift. Once again, that's natural selection, mutation, gene flow, genetic drift. Those are the four mechanisms that basically make up what we call the evolutionary synthesis. That is evolution in a nutshell. And once again, going back to our concept of uniformitarianism, if you recall that, you can look at these characteristics taking place in a laboratory, or these mechanisms taking place in a laboratory on small scale. So we can breed in a petri dish bacteria, or you can breed fruit flies that breed almost every day. And in our lifetimes, we can see tens of thousands or even millions of generations, and you can see evolution taking place. You can play with these factors as well. You can change the environment. You can turn the heat up on these fruit flies and see what happens. You can limit their water supply and increase competition and see what happens to those populations. You can mess with them a little bit and see what happens on a micro scale. And this is what we call microevolution. But microevolution and macroevolution are identical. They are the same things. The principle of uniformitarianism tells us that what you can observe on small scale, you can also read into longer lived organisms. I, as a human, am only going to see a few generations of humans, so I can't see the processes of evolution taking place because they happen not in our lifetimes, but between generations, generation after generation after generation. And I won't live long enough to see all of those changes take place. But you can look at the way that evolution works on a micro scale with shorter lived organisms, and then look at the fossil record to see the evidence for how our ancestors changed over a much longer period of time. And that's what we're going to turn our attention to in the future lessons. We're going to turn our attention to the past. Look at the fossil evidence for how we have been naturally selected for the characteristics that we have possessed today, and how our genetic species came to be. All right, see you then.